Hi guys, so a few things to go through. First, there won't be a video next week on this channel as I'm going on holiday. Dee Dee, I'm coming back to your backyard. Thank you for all of those who've commented on me taking care of my mental health, and so I'll take your advice and switch off. I'll still check in, but I need to recharge, so there'll be a video sometime around the 18th or the 19th of May. However, as it's already been made, there will be a video next week on my other channel, Tales of Tragedy, so please subscribe, as your help to get this channel off the ground would be appreciated. I also need to thank Robert Cousins and Golden Heart for recommending this case. However, on a far more important note, this video discusses the torture and murder of a very young child. I also mention animal abuse. This case is well known in the UK, but it's unlikely that many of you will know the full extent of the horror that this little boy experienced. It's important to take care of your own mental health first, so if this will distress you, then please click off now, and it was nice to see you. Anyway, on with the video. On the 3rd of August 2007, the life of Peter Connelly, known in the media initially as Baby P, came to an end. He was just 17 months old. For almost half of his short life, he endured torture and abuse, which is almost beyond imagination, but unfortunately was the reality of this innocent little boy. This included his fingernails being pulled out with pliers and his back being broken. Those responsible for this horror are amongst the most evil, depraved monsters that exist in the world, and include Peter's own mother, Tracey Connelly, her boyfriend Stephen Barker, and his brother Jason Owen. Connelly was a totally self-absorbed woman who had no interest in raising her children. Both men were paedophiles with a history of violence, and Barker was a sadist who spent his childhood torturing animals. However, Peter's death could have been avoided had it not been for the negligence of social workers and medical professionals who missed or ignored obvious signs that would have saved this little boy from a truly horrifying ordeal. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Peter Connelly's short life began on the 1st of March 2006 at the North Middlesex University Hospital. Despite him only being on this earth for 17 months, he touched the lives of those around him. He was described as a happy little boy who would often bounce with joy in his pram so that others would pick him up and give him a cuddle. Everywhere he went, he would take his Winnie the Pooh toy with him, which he would hug and chew on. He was a happy little boy who saw the world through a child's eyes. All he wanted was to be loved and protected. But unfortunately, as one newspaper article stated, he was, quote, born into a nightmare of abuse, violence and despair. He never stood a chance. This included being born to a woman, Tracey Connelly, who was entirely self-absorbed and who had no interest in taking care of him or his 3 siblings, and her utter negligence as a mother would lead to the torture and murder of Peter, as well as the rape of one of her daughters, who was just 2 years old, and the likely rape of another, who was just 8. Tracey Connelly had a difficult upbringing, although this is no excuse for what she allowed to happen to her own children, and I'll reiterate this front and centre later. She was born on the 29th of June 1981 in Leicester, the result of a liaison between her mother Mary O'Connor, her Irish-born mother, and a man called Richard Johnson, who is reported as both a travelling salesman but also a married family friend in reports I've read. Mary herself was also married to a man called Gary Cox, who Richard later claimed had paid him £5 to sleep with Mary, apparently as some sort of dare. Everyone in Connelly's life had issues. Mary was an alcoholic and a drug user. Richard, her biological father, was a convicted paedophile, and the man she called her father, Gary Cox, was a violent alcoholic. Richard later described the household that Connelly and her brother grew up in as being nothing short of horrific, with him saying, quote, Trace was brought up in a house of violence from the day she was born. Gary used to knock Mary about, blaming her for the house being so filthy. He regularly laid into her with his bare fists. He never hit the kids, but tried to turn them against their mother, saying, she's evil, don't listen to her. Mary herself described the relationship with Gary as follows, quote, oh, he was a sadist. He used to beat me up for nothing. I couldn't go out without his permission. If I went shopping, he'd time me. I thought it was the norm. If you're used to being battered by men, you think it's normal. In the end, I took a knife to my husband. Stuck it in his stomach, just straight in, straight out. Self-defense, but I couldn't prove it, and I got 2 years probation for that, but it was worth it. In around 1984, when Connelly was 2 or 3 years old, the marriage between Mary and Gary broke down, and her and her mother moved to a council estate in Islington, North London. Connelly's brother stayed with Gary until his death from a heart attack in 1988, at which point he also moved to London. Both children were badly neglected in the new house and lived in absolute squalor, whilst Mary lost herself in drink and drugs, and she would have a succession of men coming into the home. A former friend of Connelly's from primary school later reported, quote, "The flat she lived in was disgusting. There were no sheets on the bed, hardly any furniture, and they had this black mongrel dog which messed everywhere. They had these carpet tiles, and I remember once Tracey picked up a dirty tile, dropped the dog poo in the bin, and just put it back." She continued, "We'd often go round to Tracey's home to find Mary in bed smoking drugs with some boyfriend. She was always shouting at Tracey to clear out of the flat, and my mum told me she'd sometimes see Tracey wandering around, alone, late at night." At school, Connelly was isolated and lonely. This was in part due to her poor personal hygiene, with another primary school classmate later reporting, quote, "She was the kid at school no one wanted to play with. She was plump, dirty, and would turn up at school in shoes that were falling to bits and old tracksuit bottoms. Children called her Tracey the Tramp because she was so scruffy. She was always getting beaten up by other kids, and I remember seeing her at school once with a split lip." From the age of around 10 or 11 years old, Connelly began engaging in sexual acts with boys. This seems to have been the only way that she thought she could get attention. However, she was also preyed on by predatory men. A woman who knew her at the time later stated, quote, "She used to spend a lot of time in the flat of a man in his 50s or 60s. He used to give her beer and cigarettes. Once, I saw them play wrestling on the ground, which made me feel very uncomfortable, and another time, I saw him kiss her neck. She just laughed." At age 12, whilst in a drunken and drug-induced stupor, Mary told her daughter that the man that she'd called Dad, Gary Cox, was not in fact her real father, and that she was the product of an affair with Richard Johnson. Something in Connelly appears to have snapped. She created a tough exterior after this point, and would frequently get into fights, and she seemed unable to control her temper. The combination of Connelly's behaviour and the deterioration of her relationship with her mother led to the involvement of Islington Social Services, who took her and her brother into care. Her brother went to a care home in Islington, and Connelly was placed in Farney Close boarding school in West Sussex, catering for children with special educational needs, behavioural and social problems. Here again she was isolated and lonely, and began acting up, with one former pupil later recalling, quote, "She was dirty, scruffy, and her feet stank. She would only shower once a week, and her face was covered in spots. She was a big girl. She couldn't be bothered to make any effort. She used to wear Doc Marten boots or boys' shoes because her feet were size 10 and only ever wore trousers. She also had a real temper on her and would get into fights. Once, she had to be restrained by a teacher. Unfortunately, it seems that it was out of the frying pan and into the fire for Connelly and her brother, as around the time they were removed from the family home in the 1990s, a paedophile ring was active in the Islington area, grooming children in the local care homes. Some of these children were also tasked with luring other children into the clutches of these paedophiles, and this included Connelly's brother, who, as well as being abused, introduced his sister to these men. It's also implied in some reports that Connelly may have also been abused by this same brother. Tracey Connelly was not unintelligent. She went to school and managed to obtain some GCSEs, and she worked as a hairdresser when she was around 16 years old. However, her life was quickly deteriorating, with her becoming addicted to alcohol, likely as a way to drown out the abuse she suffered. She also appears to have continued to be victimised by older men. One of these potentially was a man whose name hasn't been published, but we'll call him Steve. Steve met Connelly when she was 16 years old, and he was 33. Within a year, the pair had moved into a council house in Tottenham, North London. Connelly then had 3 daughters in quick succession with Steve. They eventually got married in September 2003 at Haringey Civil Centre. It needs to be pointed out that there's false reporting that Steve was a paedophile with a previous conviction for molesting a child. This is untrue, and Steve later went to court to clear his name, and it was officially recorded that he didn't have any previous convictions of any kind. However, I do question the motives of Steve and how much of a father to the children he was. As I said, he was over double Connelly's age when they met, with her being a vulnerable and abused child. Also, during the later court proceedings, Connelly was described by her own barrister as a, quote, lazy, inadequate mother, and it's clear that before Peter was even born, there were concerns about neglect of the 3 daughters. The family lived in squalor, with Connelly spending most of her time on the internet as opposed to looking after the children. She would regularly be drunk and would proudly boast about this online, including posting on Facebook things such as, quote, I was drinking cocktails and large vodka and cokes. I got really drunk like a twat. A neighbour later reported, quote, she wasn't the cleanest person in the world. I wasn't bothered if the kids got dirty or the house was a mess. Steve must have seen and known about this, but it's unclear what he did about it. Despite the squalor and the fact they clearly couldn't take care of the 3 children they already had, Connelly became pregnant again, and on the 1st of March 2006, she gave birth to her first son, who they called Peter. However, just 3 months later, in June of that same year, the marriage was on the rocks, with the pair apparently having arguments about Connelly's unwillingness to do housework and the fact that she was flirting with men online. It also appears that by this point, Connelly had begun an affair with a 33-year-old man called Stephen Barker, who she'd met when he was doing maintenance work on a friend's flat. This ultimately led to the breakdown of the marriage, and Steve moved out. Almost immediately, in November 2006, Barker moved into the flat in Tottenham, North London, bringing along with him his pet Rottweiler and 2 pet snakes. Connelly was entirely focused on her own happiness, and she gushed online, writing on Facebook, quote, it's funny when you meet someone and fall in love. You spend as much time as possible kissing and touching and having sex. You want to make them feel so good. You just can't get enough of each other. It's great. She didn't care about the impact on the children. They were trying to process their own father moving out, and suddenly they had this unknown man moving in. The children were terrified of Barker, and with just cause. He was a sadist, a man obsessed with violence, and within a year of moving in, Peter would be dead, enduring months of torture at this man's hands. This sickening picture shows Peter kissing Barker, the man who by this point had already been abusing him for months, and just 12 weeks later would take his life. Another depraved man, Jason Owen, Barker's brother, would later also join the household and become involved in the torture and murder of this innocent child. Stephen Barker was born in June 1976, and his older brother Jason Owen was born in 1972. After Peter was murdered, Owen, who was actually born Jason David Barker, changed his surname in order to try and distance himself from the case. They were both deeply disturbed, dangerous men who should have never been anywhere near any children. The pair grew up on the Ferry Lane estate in Tottenham, North London, and were 2 of 5 siblings, with them having a younger brother and 2 sisters. Details about their dynamics in the house are difficult to comment on. When the pair were arrested for their horrific crimes, they both tried to portray the other as being the more violent, more sadistic. Barker said that he was terrified of Owen growing up, and Owen claimed the opposite. It's also been reported that both would abuse their younger brother. The truth is, these monsters were clearly both violent from a young age, and were probably a menace to each other and their siblings. They inevitably grew up in a household characterised by violence and abuse. Hurting and torturing others was a way to achieve dominance, but also likely just something to do, something they did when they were bored or just wanted to laugh. Out of the pair, Stephen Barker was clearly the more dangerous. As a child, he'd enjoy hurting animals, including torturing guinea pigs. He would also skin frogs when they were still alive, and then break their legs. Barker is reported to have had an IQ of 60, and therefore had extremely low intelligence. He was referred to as, quote, simple by those who knew him. He attended a special school in London, but apparently refused to apply himself and left without any qualifications. Instead, he became fixated on Nazism and weapons and began collecting Nazi memorabilia, knives, and martial arts weapons. He also had a crossbow and would often stride around the home dressed in combat gear. By the time he was an adult, this dangerous sadist stood as a hulking 6 foot 4 inches tall and weighed 18 stone, or around 250 pounds. He enjoyed intimidating others, always targeting those weaker than him. He got off on the look of fear in their eyes, knowing they were unable to fight back. Jason Owen was well known to the police, and before the murder of Peter, he had a string of convictions for offences including theft and arson, where he apparently set fire to his own home in order to try and make a claim for compensation. Both thought nothing of victimising others, targeting the weak and the vulnerable in order to get what they wanted. This included abusing elderly family members. The pair would frequently go with their family to visit their grandmother Hilda Barker in her home in the town of Whitstable in Kent. However, this was not a visit that Hilda looked forward to. She was terrified of her grandsons. They would mock and abuse her each time they came down. In November 1995, Hilda was 82 years old and was visited by Barker, by this point aged 19, and Owen, who was 23. They tormented and attacked Hilda, trying to coerce her into changing her will. They beat her up whilst wearing Guy Fawkes masks to increase her level of fear. They also locked her in a wardrobe, shaking it and laughing as she begged to be let out. Hilda told one of her daughters about the abuse, and both men were arrested. She was broken by this incident. Soon after, she moved out of her home and had to go to a care facility. Just 2 months later, Hilda was dead, having passed away from pneumonia. With the key witness against them deceased, and not enough evidence to make a case for attempted murder or manslaughter, all charges were dropped. So they tortured their grandmother and gotten away with it scot-free. In fact, despite how dangerous he was, this was Stephen Barker's only arrest before killing Peter Connelly. He had not actually been convicted of any offences before this point. As well as targeting the elderly, both men were paedophiles. Jason Owen had been accused of raping an 11-year-old when he was 13, and, as an adult, despite being married at one point and having 4 children, he would groom and sexually abuse several underage girls. With regards to Barker, when he moved into the Connelly household, all he saw was opportunities to abuse, torture, and rape children, and he began his campaign of terror almost immediately. It's impossible not to talk about what happened to Peter without highlighting the failures of professionals to save his life. I won't cover everything, but will highlight the most staggering missed opportunities and indefensible decisions made by these people. There are also unforgivable decisions made by members of Peter's own family that I'll cover. During this section, I'll go into detail about the horror Peter experienced, so I need to reiterate the warning from the beginning of the video. This section is distressing. So on December the 11th, 2006, Peter, who was just 9 months old, was admitted to Whittington Hospital in Archway, North London, with bruises to his head, nose, chest and right shoulder. Doctors who examined him identified that these were non-accidental injuries, and on December the 19th, Tracey Connelly was arrested on suspicion of assaulting her son. She denied injuring him and was bailed pending further investigations. Eventually, no charges were laid, as there was insufficient evidence to support a prosecution. It appears that Mary O'Connor, Connelly's mother and Peter's grandmother, was spoken to, and despite seeing that the children were terrified of Stephen Barker, she didn't tell them that he was now living at the property. She later justified this decision by saying, quote, "They asked me if he lived here, and I said I can't answer. I don't live here, but he's here more often than I am. To me, that's enough for you to see what I'm saying to you." What a load of bollocks. Clearly, she was refusing to tell them the truth, but later was trying to imply that she'd told them, but they had to read between the lines. Trust me, the pathetic statements of family members who knew what was going on get worse. Concerns about Peter's injuries did lead to a referral being made to social services. Just to explain for those not from the UK, London is divided up into different areas, known as boroughs, each with a council, which is responsible for issues in their area as expansive as rubbish collection, road maintenance, and social services, both for adults and children. As Peter lived in Tottenham, the council responsible for this area is Haringey, and the referral related to concerns about Peter was sent to their social work team. This was the same social work team who less than a decade before had failed 8-year-old Victoria Climbier, who despite obvious signs of abuse, was tortured and eventually murdered by her great-aunt, Marie-Therese Coelho, and her partner Carl Manning. It's clear from what happened next that this department had learned nothing from the death of this innocent little girl, and the mistakes made in the case of Peter Connelly are just as sickening. Initially, some positive steps were taken. Peter was removed from Connelly's care, placed with a family friend for his own safety, and he was made subject to child protection proceedings, so multi-agency involvement where there are particular concerns about a child coming to harm. Social workers visited the family home on numerous occasions, including 3 times in December 2006, to make their risk assessment. They came across Stephen Barker, but took his and Connelly's denial that he was living there at face value. On the 19th of February 2007, Tracey Connelly, Stephen Barker and the 4 children moved to 37 Penshurst Road. This would be the property where Peter would be tortured and eventually murdered. Barker also brought along his pets, including his dog and snakes. There were 2 other dogs in the property, a German Shepherd and a Staffordshire Bull Terrier. All of the dogs were allowed to defecate in the house, with this rarely being cleaned up. On the 5th of March 2007, a school nurse phoned the allocated social worker to say that she'd seen Connelly slapping one of her daughters in the face outside the school. The social worker proposed no further action. It should be noted at this point that there were at least 4 social workers who were allocated to this case, so when I say social worker, it's not always the same person, which makes this even worse, as there were multiple inept people. Also in March, social services received a tip-off that Stephen Barker was indeed Connelly's new boyfriend and was living at the property. Tracey Connelly was brought in for interview, which was recorded, and I want to play a few clips of this, where she moans about the involvement of social services, lies about how her son got injured, and again denies that Stephen Barker is her boyfriend.
I don't like having people interfering all the time. I don't mean that in a horrible way. I know that the social workers are there for a job, and I know they're there for a purpose. And at the end of all this, I hope they will back off and leave me alone and see that I am an okay mother. Does that make sense?
Makes sense.
You know.
A very straightforward thing to want.
And he'd cut there and there, like there's like a grate and where he caught himself on the table. But my instant reaction was, after initially petting him, was to take photos of the table so I could show social services when I see him, this is what happened. Because I was scared that if there's no evidence, they're going to say that I've done it. I've got a very good friend, Stephen. He's just a friend, but once the divorce comes through, my ex-husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, keeps trying to make out we're having a relationship when I wish.
In reality, at the time of this interview, Peter was being abused continuously by the sadist Stephen Barker, and this was not just physical, but also psychological and emotional abuse. Barker, sick deranged monster that he was, trained Peter to give him a Nazi salute, as well as greeting him saying Sieg Heil, and even making him refer to him as Hitler. This claim came from Tracey Connelly's biological father, Richard Johnson, who'd re-emerged on the scene and apparently saw this up close. He apparently spoke to Barker, who told him that it was a joke. Richard also said, quote, "I wanted to say something, but was just getting to know these people and didn't want to interfere." So he didn't want to interfere. The statement gets worse, with Richard later saying that he saw other abuse, including Peter's toys being thrown on the roof of the house so he couldn't play with them. I believe that his lack of action was due to his own selfishness, likely not wanting anyone digging into his past and his previous conviction for a sexual offence against a child. Or potentially he didn't want to rock the boat because he just reunited with his daughter. Either way, he was utterly selfish. This is yet again another person in Peter's life who put themselves first. Stephen Barker even trained Peter like a dog, getting him to sit by clicking his fingers. Barker would also place Peter on a stool and spin it round until he flew off, crashing into the walls or furniture. Whilst doing all of this, he would laugh hysterically. Tracey Connelly saw all of this, but she did nothing. Teeth marks later found on Peter's head indicate that he'd been mauled by a dog. This appears to have been corroborated by a 15-year-old teenage girl who lived on the same estate, who saw much of the abuse, but who was too scared of repercussions to come forward until after the trio's arrest. She later stated that Peter had been used as a training tool for Barker's Rottweiler, and Barker had trained this animal to seize Peter round the head, lift him up, and drop him on the floor. Barker didn't care who saw what he was doing. In fact, he seemed to revel in the attention, as though he was putting on a show. Peter was punched, slapped and thrown around like a rag doll by Stephen Barker. On several occasions, he was strangled to the point where he turned blue, and his bottle was rammed into his mouth with such force that he cut his lips. At 4:40 p.m. on the 9th of April 2007, just 4 months before his death, Tracey Connelly took Peter to the Accident and Emergency Department at the North Middlesex Hospital. The triage nurse noted a large swelling to the left side of his head. Connelly's account was that 4 days earlier, Peter had been pushed against a marble fireplace by another child of his age. Body maps indicated bruises and scratches on his face, head and body. A nurse called the social worker and relayed the false account given by Connelly, but rather than questioning it, the social worker did nothing. The abuse of Peter by Stephen Barker continued throughout this time, with Peter being punched, kicked and mauled, as well as being emotionally and psychologically tormented. As if Stephen Barker was not evil enough, in around May 2007, he anally raped a 2-year-old girl. Appeal documents reveal that this was in fact Peter's sister. Barker was later convicted for this, and after this conviction, Peter's other sister, who was aged 8 at the time, stated that after watching her sister being attacked, she too was raped, and apparently this was all witnessed by one of Barker's friends, who stood in the corner of the room laughing. On the 1st of June 2007, the allocated social worker made an unannounced visit to the home and observed a bruise under Peter's chin. Connelly again came up with an excuse, stating that her son had been in a fight with another child. The social worker requested that Peter be seen by a medical professional, and he was taken to accident and emergency. Doctors found multiple bruises and scratches of different ages on Peter's body, as well as grab bruise marks on his leg. Connelly claimed that she'd been forced to grab her son to stop him from falling over. Doctors informed the social worker, but she allowed Peter to return to the family home because an assurance was given that a family friend would be staying over, so they would be able to check on the situation. The issue here is that we tend to have friends who share our values. Was his friend checked out? No. The social worker simply gave it the okay and said they would pick up the situation next week. Later this same month, Stephen Barker's older brother, Jason Owen, turned up at the house. He needed a place to lay low, and in tow was his 15-year-old girlfriend. Owen was 35 years old at this point, and the 15-year-old child was a runaway, and social services and the police were looking for her. The brothers reuniting meant that the level of horror that Peter experienced increased in the last few months of his life. During this time, he was beaten savagely to the point where his ribs were broken, and most sickeningly of all, his fingernails were pulled off with pliers. The 15-year-old girlfriend of Jason Owen, who witnessed much of what happened to Peter in those last months, also indicated that Barker filmed the torture of this innocent little boy, saying, quote, "Steve used to laugh as he hit little Peter. He was so evil. He would do horrible things to him and record it on his mobile phone." This mobile phone was eventually disposed of and never recovered. Jason Owen was not just a bystander. He too abused Peter, although the extent of his involvement is unclear. It appears at the very least he swung him around by his legs. On July the 29th, 2007, Stephen Barker broke Peter's back. This was witnessed by the 15-year-old neighbour, and she gave a horrifying account of this incident. She stated that Barker, quote, "sat smirking on the sofa, smoking cannabis, and playing with baby P like he was a rag doll. Then I suddenly heard a loud crack that echoed through the house as the baby's little backbone snapped in half." What happened exactly is unclear, but it appears Barker lifted this tiny 17-month-old child up and then brought him down with all of his might onto his knee. This caused an injury which was later described as what someone would experience in a high-speed car crash. The next day, July the 30th, just 4 days before his death, a social worker from Haringey Council was due to attend a home visit to see Peter. Tracey Connelly was bragging about how stupid the professionals were, telling this teenage neighbour that she, quote, couldn't believe these social workers kept falling for it. By this point, Peter was in excruciating pain and was unable to stand. Connelly strapped her son into his pushchair and smeared chocolate around his mouth to cover the injuries to his face. When the social worker arrived, she apparently said to Peter, quote, "Hello, little fella," before he was pushed into another room and the door closed. The social worker didn't ask any questions and later reported that Peter was happy and healthy. The last opportunity to save Peter Connelly's life came on the 1st of August 2007, less than 48 hours before his death. This last decision is absolutely disgusting and was made not by a social worker, but by a doctor. Not just any doctor, but a consultant paediatrician, so a senior doctor whose sole job was to treat children. This was Dr. Saba Al-Zayat, who Peter was brought to at St Anne's Hospital in Tottenham. She decided not to carry out a full examination of Peter, as he was, quote, miserable and cranky. The negligence of this woman is absolutely astonishing. Children are often miserable and cranky. This doesn't mean this is an excuse not to examine them, and maybe there's a reason why they're acting in this way. In the case of Peter, this was because he was in so much pain. By this point, he had around 50 horrific injuries on his tiny body. This was later determined to include 8 fractured ribs, a broken back, bleeding around the spine, cuts to the top of his head, missing fingernails, bite marks on his head, likely from a dog, skin missing from his lips and tongue, a fractured shin bone, 20 bruises over his entire body. In addition, Peter was malnourished and underweight, and his left ear was ripped and coming away from the side of his head, and this was later determined to likely have been caused by someone holding the earlobe and pulling with considerable force. This is not a full list of injuries, but even this shows the horror and pain that Peter went through in his final months alive. How the fuck did Dr. Al-Zayat miss all of this? I mean, some of these were obvious injuries, which I cannot believe were not noticeable from just looking at Peter, for example his earlobe. However, instead of doing her job, Dr. Al-Zayat simply sent Peter and Connelly away. This was the last time he would be seen alive by anyone outside of the family home. At some point late on the 2nd of August 2007, Peter was subjected to one final assault when someone, almost definitely Stephen Barker, punched him in the face with all of their might. This knocked out a tooth, which was later found in his stomach. The trauma of this injury caused his spinal injury to begin bleeding again, which led to a cardiac arrest, and Peter Connelly died during the night in his cot alone. At 11:35 a.m. on Friday, August 3rd, 2007, Tracey Connelly dialed 999 and said that she'd found her son not breathing in his cot and she thought he was dead. An ambulance sped to 37 Penshurst Road and found Peter in his blood-splattered cot, stiff and blue. Peter Connelly was taken to the North Middlesex Hospital, where he was pronounced dead at 12:20 p.m. When told that Peter was dead, Tracey Connelly put in an Oscar-worthy performance, throwing herself on the floor and screaming, quote, "Oh God, don't take away my baby boy. I've been waiting so long for a boy." Connelly was asked by the doctors about the circumstances leading to her son's death, specifically whether he'd been ill the night before, and she responded saying, quote, "Yes, he was unwell last night, but I didn't bring him to hospital because I get accused of hurting him." Clearly this is a lie, but even whilst lying, Tracey Connelly cannot hide how utterly self-absorbed she is, and her lack of consideration for anyone else. "My child was sick, but I didn't take him to get treatment because I might get in trouble." With her it's all me, me, me. However, in reality, Tracey Connelly had known her son was dead for hours before she dialed 999, and she, Stephen Barker and Jason Owen cleaned up the murder scene before help was called. They bagged up some of Peter's bloody clothes and bedding, which Owen then dumped in a river. Owen then fled with his 15-year-old girlfriend in tow. The police were notified immediately, and it was clear even from a cursory examination that Peter had suffered a catalogue of horrific injuries, and the full extent of the torture he endured was only fully revealed during the subsequent autopsy. Tracey Connelly was arrested on suspicion of murder on the same day that Peter was declared dead. At this point, the police weren't fully aware of her connection with Stephen Barker or Jason Owen, and they actually bumped into one of them when they returned to the scene a few hours after Peter died. At the property, they came face to face with Stephen Barker, who claimed that he was only there to do maintenance work and that he barely knew Tracey Connelly. His details were taken, and he too then disappeared to join his brother and his underage girlfriend, who were hiding out at a campsite in Epping Forest, about 20 miles away. The house was absolutely disgusting. Police found human and dog feces, dead rats and chicks, which were for feeding to Barker's 2 pet snakes. The place was also infested with fleas, and on the kitchen sideboard lay a dismembered rabbit. Despite attempts to get rid of incriminating evidence, blood-stained clothing belonging to Peter was recovered. The police soon established who Barker and Owen were and began searching for them to arrest them. They managed to evade capture for 11 days. However, on the 14th of August 2007, a site manager called Margaret Wright became suspicious when the trio failed to pay their daily site charges, and she believed that Stephen Barker was acting really suspiciously. She kept him talking and offered him free food and drink while she waited for the police, who she'd called. They arrived and arrested Barker on the spot. Owen and the 15-year-old girl had seen the approaching police cars and fled the scene, but were arrested a short distance away, although it was clear the 15-year-old had nothing to do with the crime, and she was released. A police officer later stated that Jason Owen seemed more concerned that he'd been found in the company of an underage girl than the fact that he was being held on suspicion of killing a child. In an interview, Tracey Connelly claimed complete ignorance. She stated she could not explain the signs of torture that were evident on her son's body. She seemed to actually believe that denying everything would get her off the hook. What makes this woman even more despicable is that it turned out that she was 3 months pregnant with Stephen Barker's child at the time of her arrest, so while she was watching her son being tortured, she was carrying another life inside of her. Jason Owen stated that Connelly and Barker had abused and beaten Peter, and he had nothing to do with this. Stephen Barker implicated his brother by stating that he and Connelly were the ones responsible, and he said that Owen had been the one to dispose of evidence. As well as this offence, the surviving children had been taken into care, and the youngest daughter, who just turned 3, had told the foster carer that she'd seen Barker's willy and that he'd hurt her, before describing being raped. Barker was also questioned about this, but denied everything. Nevertheless, he was charged with rape. With regards to the death of Peter, what happened next is slightly unclear. It appears that Tracey Connelly and Stephen Barker were charged with murder and causing or allowing the death of a child and remanded to prison. Jason Owen was apparently also charged with murder and causing or allowing the death of a child, obviously extremely serious charges, but he was bailed, so he remained free right up until the trial, which began in November 2008 at the Old Bailey. Why he was allowed to remain at liberty is really unclear. I don't remember a case where someone was charged with murder and they were allowed to remain in the world. This was especially surprising as Jason Owen had no qualms about showing the monster that he was. He told friends that he was on bail because, quote, "me and a friend tortured someone, but we got caught because we went a bit too far." I mean, just think about that statement. It shows how twisted this man is. I mean, he seems to imply we were torturing someone, all good, but it all went a bit far, sorry. Also, he failed to mention that the person he tortured was a 17-month-old child. However, when the trial actually began, the police became aware that Jason Owen was trying to flee the country, and so he joined his co-defendants in prison. Whilst Tracey Connelly was on remand, she gave birth to her 5th child, with Barker being the father. What happened to this child is unclear, but I assume it was taken from her and likely adopted. At the trial, all 3 pleaded not guilty to murder, and Stephen Barker and Jason Owen also pleaded not guilty to causing or allowing the death of a child. Tracey Connelly pleaded not guilty to murder, but admitted causing or allowing the death of a child. The charges are a little confusing, so I will explain what it means as we go along. So Tracey Connelly was essentially saying that she didn't actually kill Peter, but stood by whilst this happened. Barker and Owen were basically just denying everything. None of the 3 showed any remorse. Tracey Connelly looked bored and irritated, just being in the court. However, she would put on an act, sobbing to herself, but only when the jury were in the room. Stephen Barker was described as, quote, gormless, giving no understanding that he understood the seriousness of his situation, nor that he cared. During the trial itself, Barker and Owen turned on each other, stating that each was the one responsible for the death of baby Peter. Unbelievably, all 3 were acquitted of murder due to insufficient evidence. Trust me, several content creators and journalists have questioned this decision. The rationale has not been explicitly laid out, but from what I gather, for a charge of murder, an intent to kill or cause serious injury has to be established, and for the final assault, where Peter was punched in the face, it could not be established firstly who had done this, and also whether they intended to kill Peter or seriously injure him. That to me is ridiculous. How, with the pattern of torture laid out in the court, an intention to kill or seriously harm Peter could not be established is beyond me. Can't tell who did it, convict all the fuckers. Instead, Barker and Owen were convicted of causing or allowing the death of a child. So essentially Connelly, Barker and Owen were convicted of being involved in the circumstances which led to Peter Connelly's death, but no one was held specifically responsible for his death. Sorry, but I totally disagree with the court. Peter was tortured and murdered. Simple as that. The fact that these three were not convicted of murder meant their sentences were pathetic, but before they were sentenced for their involvement in the death of Peter, Stephen Barker stood alone in the dock to face trial for raping Peter's 2-year-old sister. His trial for this offence began at the Old Bailey in April 2009. Showing the monster that he was, Barker pleaded not guilty and forced the girl, aged 4 by this point, to give evidence, making her the youngest rape victim in British legal history at that point to testify in a criminal case. Barker's barrister stated that the girl's evidence was unclear and that she was not a reliable witness and that her testimony should be thrown out. The judge told him to fuck off, well in polite terms. On the 1st of May 2009, Stephen Barker was found guilty of anally raping Peter's 2-year-old sister. On the 22nd of May 2009, Tracey Connelly, Stephen Barker and Jason Owen stood before Judge Philip Kramer for sentencing. Pre-sentence reports have been prepared on all three, and Connelly, despite her guilty plea, continues to claim she had no idea that her son was being harmed. She had clearly just admitted culpability for a lesser sentence. Judge Kramer stated, in reference to Connelly, quote, "I'm satisfied that you acted selfishly because your priority was your relationship with Barker. You two abused the position of trust you held towards your son in a situation where, living in the same household, there were other young children who were likely to be damaged psychologically by what they have lived through." Turning to Barker, the judge said, quote, "I'm satisfied that on the evidence, whatever your role and motivation, you played a major role in the events between December 2006 and August, which culminated in Peter's death. With regards to the rape, he said, in my judgment, this offence combines the aggravating features of a massive breach of trust and rape of the most vulnerable of victims, a very young child." He then sentenced them. For her involvement in the death of her son Peter, Tracey Connelly was sentenced to an indefinite sentence for public protection, known as an IPP, essentially a life sentence, with a minimum tariff of just 5 years to serve before she could apply for parole. But this sentence meant that she would be monitored for the rest of her life and could be recalled to prison at any point. Jason Owen was also given an IPP sentence with a minimum tariff of just 3 years before he could apply for parole. Again, the one saving grace of this sentence was that Owen would be monitored for the rest of his life and could be returned to prison at any point if he breached his post-release conditions. However, months later, he appealed this sentence and it was replaced with a sentence of just 6 years, so he would serve 3 years in prison, be automatically released, and after 6 years would be totally free of oversight. For his involvement in the death of Peter, Stephen Barker was sentenced to just 12 years in prison, but for the rape of his 2-year-old sister, he was given a life sentence with a minimum tariff of 10 years to serve before he could apply for parole. He later appealed his rape conviction, but this was thrown out. These sentences were appalling, both the punishment for torturing and killing 17-month-old Peter Connelly and Barker's sentence for raping a 2-year-old. Both Connelly and Owen are now free. Tracey Connelly served her time in segregation away from other prisoners as she was a target for retribution when the horror of her crimes became known after the trial. However, she is described as being very jovial in prison and never showing any remorse for her behaviour. She even formed a friendship with serial killer Rose West and wrote to a friend about how the two would play Scrabble and cook together. Connelly repeatedly claimed she was innocent and had no idea that her son was being tortured under her own roof. In one deranged letter, she wrote that she wanted to join Peter in heaven, but then in the next sentence described how when she came out, she was going to, quote, have lots of fun. Despite her remorselessness, Connelly was granted parole in 2013 after serving just 5 years, including time she spent on remand before her trial. 2 years later, she was sent back to prison for breaching her licence conditions, and I've read that this was due to her sending naked pictures of herself to men online. I imagine there was more to this, but regardless, back she went to prison. She remained there for another 7 years, and in May 2022, it was reported that the parole board had again granted her release. This caused uproar, and the Justice Secretary at the time, Dominic Raab, appealed to the parole board to reconsider their decision, with him describing Connelly as, quote, pure evil. He was ignored, and a month later, the now 40-year-old Tracey Connelly was released back into the world under an assumed identity. She's apparently still out there somewhere at the time of recording. Pictures of her have been released, going about her day without a care in the world. On a positive note, her daughters have essentially disowned her. Jason Owen was released after serving just 3 years in August 2011. In 2013, he was recalled back to prison for breaching his licence conditions, although no details as to what he did were released. He was then re-released in 2014 at the end of his sentence with no oversight. A report from 2015 showed that he too was living under an assumed identity and was working as a fitness and life coach. I mean a life coach. What could he possibly teach people aside from how to be a fucking prick? He too remains in the community, as far as I'm aware. Unfortunately, enough time has passed that he's very unlikely to be recognised, which makes me sick to my stomach, knowing that day in, day out, people are likely interacting with this monster, with him referring to himself by his false name, extending his hand in friendship, with a smile plastered on his face. Stephen Barker has been eligible for parole since approximately 2018, but has been kept behind bars due to still being considered too risky. He's 48 years old now, so potentially with decades of life left. This creature is far too dangerous to ever be released. If he's let out, he will kill again, I've no doubt. It was only after the trio were convicted and sentenced that the full details of the horror that Baby P was subjected to were made public. This included pictures of the three responsible being published along with their names. In addition, Peter, who'd been known as Baby P throughout the case, was finally identified by his full name. These further details compounded the public's anger. In less than a decade, Haringey Social Services had been in the news for their failure to protect two vulnerable children who had suffered horrifying deaths despite clear warnings they were being abused. One newspaper ran the headline, quote, "Blood on their hands," related to this department, and I don't disagree. A serious case review was conducted to look at the role of individual agencies and those employed by them to determine what went wrong, why, and what could be learnt from this. The report was published in 2010. Various agencies were criticised, but front and centre was Haringey Social Services' complete negligence. The outrage went all the way to the corridors of power, and there was significant political pressure that people should pay for their failure to protect a vulnerable child. 4 social workers involved in the case were fired, as well as their boss, Sharon Shoesmith. However, in 2013, Shoesmith won an unfair dismissal claim with the Court of Appeal, who sided with her that she'd been vilified by the press and scapegoated. She won a financial payout, which has not been disclosed, but is estimated to have been in the region of around £600,000. In 2015, it was reported that she was lecturing on childcare at conferences. Should the social workers have lost their jobs? Absolutely, because it appears they were apparently blind and had no sense of smell. Seriously, I mean, Stephen Barker smoked cannabis day in and day out. How could they not smell this and the odour of dog shit? I mean, the place must have stunk. They also couldn't see fleas jumping around all over the place and shit marks on the floor. Social workers are not the only ones to lose their jobs. Dr. Sabah Al-Zayat, who didn't examine Peter less than 2 days before his death because he was grisly, was fired from her job and then suspended from practicing medicine by the General Medical Council. She later tried to sue the hospital for damages, but this thankfully went nowhere. Checking the medical register today, it appears she's still not a doctor, which suggests that she wasn't able to get the original decision overturned. Another doctor, who failed to examine Peter properly, was suspended from practicing for a year, but not struck off. The protection of Peter Connelly was described as being, quote, completely inadequate, and changes were recommended, including increased professional curiosity, i.e. social workers not just taking the word of those around the child, who are usually the ones they're at risk from, at face value, as well as better inter-agency working. These were basically exactly the same recommendations made in the aftermath of the death of Victoria Climbier in 2000. The council clearly learnt nothing the first time round. I pray to God they actually learned something from the horrific death of Peter. At the centre of this case is Peter Connelly, a 17-month-old little boy who was murdered, because that's what it was, when he should have been protected. It's been almost 2 decades since his death, and today, Peter would have been 18 years old, just starting his life as an adult, with his whole life ahead of him. However, whilst the people who killed him are walking free or getting 3 meals a day and a roof over their head, all that is left of Peter are memories, home videos, photos, and his gravestone. Like many of you, his photo and name is seared into my brain and into my heart. This little boy who loved chewing on his Winnie the Pooh toy will never be forgotten. Rest in peace, little angel, and know that you are loved with all of our hearts. This section will focus predominantly on Tracey Connelly and Stephen Barker, but will also mention Jason Owen. So with Tracey Connelly, articles have been written about whether she was a victim or a monster. The answer, in my humble opinion, is both. However, while she didn't choose to be a victim as a child, she chose to be a monster as an adult. Connelly had a terrible childhood, there's no doubt about that. She had no one in her life who cared about her or put her needs first. Her mother, Mary O'Connor, sounds like an absolutely vile woman, completely self-absorbed, who lost herself in the bottle rather than raising her children. The same goes for the man who she thought was her father, Gary Cox. He was a violent alcoholic, and her biological father, Richard Johnson, was a paedophile. Mary and Richard are particularly despicable people, as they clearly knew what was going on, but did nothing at the time to save Peter. But when they had the opportunity to be interviewed by the newspapers, probably to feel important, they revelled in revealing all the salacious details. Being surrounded by people who are entirely self-absorbed and narcissistic, coupled with the violence she saw and experienced, undoubtedly shaped Connelly into what she became, a woman who had no compassion or empathy for other people, who was driven by her own selfish desires, no matter what the cost. At the core of Tracey Connelly is absolutely no self-esteem and pure fear. She'd been abused as a child and was clearly unwanted, so she turned to men as a way to get validation. I imagine she was abused by every creepy old man in the area, but, to her, this was attention. Any attention was good attention. She also used the internet to get people to notice her, posting pathetic messages, clearly intending to get a response from someone, anyone. She appears to have been incapable of existing outside of a relationship, and began a relationship with a much older man when she was still a teenager. However, during this time, it appears she continued going online, flirting with men, and I imagine having multiple affairs. She needed that validation continuously, terrified that one relationship would end, so she needed to make sure there were backups. I've read that Tracey Connelly would dote on her children when they were very young, but as soon as they began to walk and talk, she would essentially leave them to fend for themselves. This is a perfect example of how Connelly saw children, as things which were of benefit to her. I imagine when she was pregnant and when she gave birth to her children, she revelled in the attention, people asking her how far along she was, people cooing over the new baby. But eventually, no one paid attention to her anymore. The child had served their purpose. So she then thought, right, discard them and make another baby to get the attention she craved. Rinse and repeat. She didn't care, or really love any of the children. They were just a means to an end. Then her husband left her. She couldn't stand to be alone, and so Stephen Barker moved in. I cannot imagine this lumbering 6'4" fucknut was anything but absolutely terrifying, exuding menace and danger, but it didn't matter. He was paying her attention. Fuck everyone else. Stephen Barker is an extremely dangerous man, a sadistic psychopath who one detective stated was, quote, fixated with pain. The environment he and his brother Jason Owen grew up in was hellish. Violence was all he knew, how he gained respect, dominance and power. He tortured his pets as a way to feel in control in his life. I have no doubt the killing was not the main objective. It was the cries of the animals, their screams. He was fixated with Nazism and was no doubt drawn to the atrocities of the regime. He marched around in combat gear, lightly imagining himself being in the SS or even the Fuhrer himself. People make a misconception that people with low IQ are benign, incapable of acts such as this, but this assumption is so dangerous. Yes, Stephen Barker had a limited IQ, but what intelligence he had, he focused on his craft, getting himself in positions where he could torture and abuse others. I imagine he sensed Tracey Connelly's character, the fact she was desperate to be wanted, and he likely thought he'd hit gold. He could do whatever he wanted, and she would let him, as long as he told her he loved her. And so, he was like a kid in a candy store. He had children to torture, and no one would stop him, and he indulged his most sadistic tendencies. Everything he did was about causing pain and distress in others. He laughed whilst little Peter was screaming. This was all just a joke to him. He only raped a 2-year-old, specifically to cause her as much pain as possible. The seriousness of his offending increased when Jason Owen arrived on the scene. Owen was a paedophile who targeted children for his own ends. He too saw children, merely as objects. And given he grew up in the same surroundings as Barker, he saw this as completely normal. Combine these two things, and you have a slug of a man who likely laughed along with his brother and was inevitably involved in the torture of Peter. They likely fed off each other, engaging in more sadistic acts to impress the other. I think the danger of Stephen Barker is epitomised by the fact that I have no doubt he would have killed every single person in that household. If the 2-year-old child he raped had told anyone about what he'd done while he was around, he would have killed her. Similarly, if her 8-year-old sister, who he likely also raped, had raised the alarm, he would have ended her life without hesitation. The same with Tracey Connelly. He would have slaughtered her if she defied him in any way. He, like her, is incapable of love, remorse, or empathy. He sat in his trial where the torture and death of a 70-month-old child was being discussed with a gormless expression on his face. I imagine he had no idea what the fuss was all about, and he would have had the same stupid expression on his face even if he was sat in the court talking about multiple murders. If he is released, he will kill again. He is a sadist and a psychopath. These facts will never change. For the sake of everyone, he should end his days behind prison walls. Returning back to Tracey Connelly, her level of evil is epitomised by two facts. Firstly, when you think about it, she must have known everything that was going on and no doubt saw most of it. Stephen Barker wanted an audience. He wanted people to see what he was doing. If they didn't see it, he would have told them. So Connelly knew what was happening to Peter. She knew at least one of her daughters had been raped, and she didn't care. As long as she got what she wanted, as long as she could stay in the relationship, it didn't matter. The lives of her own children meant nothing compared to this. The second point is that she was pregnant with her 5th child, whilst allowing her 4th child to be tortured and killed. She was pregnant, and no doubt revelling in the attention. She couldn't care less what happened to the child when it was born, and potentially, she knew that if it was a girl, Barker would have raped her, and if it was a boy, he would have tortured and killed him. Again, she didn't care about the horror this child would experience, as long as she got what she wanted. The fact she's never shown any remorse and is walking free is one of the worst elements of this case. She has no right to call herself a mother, but unfortunately, I think it will only be a matter of time until she gives birth to more children, and we again have to rely on social services to try and save these children's lives. This is a truly disturbing case, and I hope you guys who have watched it through are okay. Please tell me your thoughts in the comments below. If you like the content, then consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button. You can also send a one-off donation to support the channel using the thanks button. It'd be great if you could also like, share and subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.